Were you drafted, or did you enlist?
I was drafted.
You were drafted, okay. What year were you drafted in?
1943.
1943, okay. Where were you living at the time when you got the notice from Uncle Sam?
In Lebo, Kansas, small town in eastern Kansas where I had been born and grew up.
And you went to high school there?
High school and finished in May of 42. Wanted to play football. My dream was to be a high school football coach, basketball coach. And I wanted to play football. There's a little teacher's college in Emporia State near the town where I grew up. I enrolled there in the fall semester, got to play football, and then was drafted in March.
Okay, I want to ask you a question. Everybody for your generation knows or remembers where they were when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So where were you? What was going on when you first heard about what
Sunday
happened?
afternoon, it was about 2 in the afternoon in Kansas. We'd been to church that morning. I was sitting out in front of my girlfriend's house, Phyllis Perry, who later became Phyllis Bowlin. And we were sitting out in my dad's car in front of her house. Her younger sister came running out and said, "Pearl Harbor's been bombed." We had no idea what Pearl Harbor was, where it was, but that's where we were.
Did you keep up with the news? Were you aware of what was going on overseas?
Well, generally, but 17-year-old Midwest, Europe was so far away, although, my father and Phyllis's father had both been in World War I. And, we knew generally, but, I was so involved in high school and football, basketball, and all that, girlfriend, that really not seriously aware of what was at stake, I guess.
Now, after you graduated from high school, and the United States was obviously engaged in a war between the Axis powers, did you decide, you went ahead and decided you went to college, or did you go to the ASTP program after you were drafted?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, see, I went ahead and went in the service rather than joining a program or, I wanted to play football, and my draft number was coming up, so I just waited. Actually, I called the draft board and said I'm ready to go, so they moved it up a month or two. Went into the service at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, rode the train out to what turned out to be Camp Hahn, California, an anti-aircraft training camp right across from March Field. Spent 3 or 4 weeks there. In fact, learned one of the lessons about, I wasn't aware of that you don't volunteer for anything in the Army. I think the second day there we lined up and the first sergeant said, "Does anyone know how to type?" And I typed and had a typing class in high school, held up my hand. Wound up in the battalion supply company, and as a result, never really got basic training because they needed people. I made corporal within 3-4 weeks and continued there. Went out to the Mojave Desert shortly after that for the field training. This is by now it's July, temperature's 100 degrees and plus scorpions, rattlesnakes, and decided school wasn't so bad after all. So that's when I applied for ASTP.
And you were selected.
I was selected.
And where did you go to school for ASTP?
Brigham Young University. There were 220 of us, and most of them wound up in the 70th later. But to spend 9 months at BYU doing pre-engineering and fantastic professors. I think there were 220 of us in the cadet program, maybe 10 or 12 civilian men and 2,200 young Mormon girls. So it was an interesting 9 months.
The ASTP program was an Army program, but yet you were going to school at a civilian university. How was that life? I mean, was the Army routine pushed, or was it more of the civilian life?
It was a combination. Our commandant, Major Powell, was well into his 60s, I think, at that time. He loved parades and dinners and this kind of thing, so he involved us in the social life on the campus. We still, we lived in dormitories, but still dressed in our uniforms, would march to class. But the weekends we were pretty much free and no real soldier duties.
I guess at the time it was one of the best duties going, huh? In a sense?
I understand. I suppose the Air Cadet program was maybe similar, but yeah, it was great.
When did you get wind of the program ending, or rumors started floating around?
Well, it was early spring of 44 that the the word was, well, they don't need all those engineers that we need the infantrymen over in Europe now. So it wasn't a big surprise. We completed about half of that third term. As a result of that, though, I got a fair number of engineering credits when I went back to school after the war.
That's good. Now, when the program ended, did you have a say as to what unit you went in? I know it sounds dumb, but
This was the Army, Steve.
Yeah, right. Or did they told you where you're going?
Yeah. No, we were shipped, and all of our men, I think, went to the 70th there at Camp Adair.
Mm-hmm. What were your impressions of Camp Adair when you arrived?
Well, first time, I guess, in Oregon, wet, it was spring, but, the people were good. It was back to the Army, but quite an abrupt. However, instead of going into the infantry, which most of the men did, I wound up in the artillery. And for years I thought it was because I had flat feet. I thought, well, they put me in artillery. Found out years later, after the war, got with my battery commander, Dave Garrison, and he said, no, I was screening those men coming in. I saw you play some football, and I was trying to put together a football team. So that's how you wound up in the artillery.
I see. And when did you arrive at Camp Adair? Was that in 44?
Yeah, spring of 44.
So March, April, somewhere in there? Okay. And then not soon after that, describe some of your training that you had at Adair as an artilleryman. What were some of the things that you went through?
Well, there was a firing range again, and a lot of it was fairly basic. But my assigned job was scout corporal, which meant taking an aiming circle, an instrument, and lining up the artillery pieces when you went into position. But I also wound up with training forward observer type training and radio operations. So it was a combination.
And so on training maneuvers that you had at Dare, and I guess later at Fort Leonard Wood, you would go out with infantry units and practice as a forward observer, things of that nature?
Yeah, I was a radio man for the Forward Observer, and there was the field maneuvers.
If there's one incident that really stands out at Camp Adair during your training there, what would that be? Good or bad?
Well, the one that stands out at Fort Leonard Wood is when I ran a Jeep into a ditch, or a foxhole had been dug out. Leaves had filled the foxhole, and I think I ruined the front end of that Jeep. But the people at Camp Adair were friendly. The folks in the area there, Bob Gray, my good friend, it was an L275, it's 274. He and I would hitchhike out to the coast a couple times, Newport, Oregon, and enjoyed that. And his home was in White Salmon, Washington, so a couple of times we got up as far as White Salmon and visited his mother and sister up there. But to be honest, as far as any military experience there, nothing really stands out.
What about well, that was at Leonard Wood. So you're at Leonard Wood, and you guys, now the 70th was shipped over a little bit differently than most of the divisions. You guys were separated. The regiments went first.
That was because the Battle of the Bulge, well, the Battle of the Bulge didn't start till December 14th, but they needed the infantry over there, so they shipped the 3 regiments over to relieve add 2 other divisions. The special troops came about a month later, actually.
Right. Oh, what was the trip like from Fort Leonard Wood to Boston, Massachusetts, and then from Boston all the way to Marseille?
Okay, from Fort Leonard Wood to Camp Miles Standish was by train, of course, and that was close to Boston. We were at Miles Standish for several days. In fact, my good friend Oliver Hill, that lives in Massachusetts, he and I were both in the C-888 3rd, and he had visited my home in Kansas when we were at Fort Leonard Wood. So I got to spend Christmas with his family before shipping out overseas.
So that's a memory it kind of sticks out, doesn't it, after not knowing what was going to happen in the future. Yeah. So you boarded the ship, and what ship was it when you went over?
This was the U.S. Mariposa that had been in the South Sea cruise line prior to the war, so it was a luxury liner converted to troop transport. But
it was a luxury liner converted, but it didn't have any of the amenities of a luxury liner, did it, in your case?
Converted meant, fortunately, I was bunked in the ballroom. I think there were 5 or 6 high hammocks, that we slept in, and But growing up in Kansas, no experience on the ocean at all. I was fortunate. I wasn't seasick, and I enjoyed being up on the bow of the ship and watching the water and the waves and all. So it was a good experience.
And that trip took 10 days, 10, 11 days, I believe, right?
From January 8th to January 18th to Marseille.
Can you kind of describe the routine that you went through? How many times you were served chow? Did you go through any calisthenics? Did you go through any kind of maybe classroom to keep your training skills up or anything like that?
No, meals were twice a day, as I recall, with the number on the ship. We had a life jacket drill or lifeboat drill a couple times a day, as I recall. And but so it was just luxury, laying on the deck in the sun and all. It was good weather most of the way.
I guess before you were shipped out, I'm sure there was rumors flying as to where the division was going. If you can recall, if you heard any exotic locations where you might have been heading, what bets were on the line or anything like that, can you recall any of that?
To be honest, Steve, I don't. I just sort of went where they told me and didn't worry too much about the consequences.
Okay, so January 18th, you crossed the strait into the Straits of Gibraltar. You're in
probably a day or two before that. We landed or got into the Marseille Bay there on the 18th.
And that was January, so the weather wasn't too great.
Well, I don't recall no real storms at least. Mm-hmm. And, as we passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, we were joined by a couple of little destroyer escorts. I remember one day there was a flurry of activity and they dropped some depth charges. Reportedly, there was a submarine U-boat sighted or suspected in the area, but we never saw anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so you hit Marseille, you disembark, and I believe you hit the CP2, is that Delta Base?
Yeah.
Right. What were the conditions up there?
A bit challenging. Windy, cold, barren area in pup tents. Each evening, Checkpoint Charlie would fly over, a German single-engine plane would fly over the area, putt-putting, but it was just kind of a dreary existence there.
Did you draw your equipment there, or was that later, once you arrived at the front?
No, we got our equipment there, and our vehicles. I wound up driving a Jeep up I think it was about 4 days to get up to the Epinal area.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't ride the 40 and 8 up to the front?
I missed that.
You missed that. Okay, so you had the luxury of sitting in your own seat.
Exactly.
You got to the front. What were your feelings as you got closer to your final destination?
Obviously became more aware of what was at stake, that this was a war, it was real, and you could hear the guns. I guess you just still knew you had a job to do and concentrated on that. A lot of unknowns, a little apprehension, but always look forward to mail and try to write a letter or two each day or every other day.
Mm-hmm. Keep in contact with the family?
Right.
Maintain that contact at home?
Exactly, yeah.
You get to the front. What became your duty assignment? Where were you? Where was the 883rd kind of located at the time you finally got situated?
Well, we were Etling, maybe a mile or less behind the infantry, the front lines, but close enough to know that this was a real war. My job was setting up the people when we went into position with the aiming circle, but shortly after that, the order came through that they wanted a second forward observer team out. So Oliver Hill, who was the radio man on the other team, he and I both were serving different forward observers as radio men.
Mm-hmm. And you got up to the front, I believe, around February 6th or 7th, somewhere in there?
February 7th was the first day of combat, as I recall.
And your battalion, the 883rd, was mainly in support of the 275th, is that correct?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And did that assignment ever change that you recall?
Not to my knowledge. Again, as a T5 corporal, you're not aware of what was going on.
Okay, so kind of describe the day-to-day activities that you went through that your job entailed during combat.
Well, we traveled with the infantry, usually some distance behind, or within 100 yards or two. When they came on a target where they required artillery shells, our observer would estimate where that location was and call, and I would radio back to the battery to give the position and the information for firing on the target.
And civilians, they worry about their 8-hour day. You didn't have an 8-hour day in the Army, did you?
It was 24/7
Yeah.
at that time.
Can you describe the events leading up to the time that you went out and you met that fateful day for you?
Well, the first 2 or 3 days it was a pretty static situation, and then the order was given to try to eliminate a little bulge in our lines, to straighten the lines is what they described it. So we started on the attack, and didn't meet a lot of strong resistance, at least that I saw, until it was February 21st, and we got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, as I recall, to take off, and I think the 3rd Battalion, 3 companies, were in this operation that was assigned to encircle a little town of Alsting. This is before Spicheren and Forbach. The Germans occupied Alsting. We were ordered to try to maneuver by noon that day to cut their retreat off. And things had gone reasonably well, a little action, but again, we were 100 or 200 yards behind, so it wasn't until around noon, and I had a feeling that no one really knew where we were, as far as it was a wooded area, and but about noon is when we ran into an ambush. The Germans obviously knew we were coming. The call came for artillery, so Lieutenant Boyd and I and Stewart, the other radio man, ran forward probably 100 yards, and the infantrymen were in a ditch. Turned out to be a tank trap, a ditch probably 4 or 5 feet deep, 3 or 4 feet wide, maybe wider. Had water and barbed wire in the bottom. But the German with 88s were in a position, not too much farther in front of it, but had us pinned down. We got into the ditch, set up the radio. It came in 2 parts, the battery pack and the radio and the antenna. Made contact with the battery, and Lieutenant Boyd asked for fire. About that time, I think, is when Lieutenant Howard White, the L Company commander, within 10 or 12 feet of me, appeared to take a direct hit from the 88. He died there. But made contact with the battery, asked for fire. I remember the man, the officer at the battery saying, "Do you want high explosive or smoke?" And Lieutenant Boyd said, "High explosive wouldn't do any good on that tank." Let's pin us down. High explosive. He said smoke wouldn't do any good on the tank. Fire high explosive. They fired, but we had no chance of observing where it landed. So about that time was when Lieutenant Boyd said we're going to have to pull back. I was on the radio and again talking to the officer at the battery. Gerald Stewart and I on the radio turned around after. Well, I asked Lieutenant Boyd if we should destroy the radio because we carried a phosphorus grenade for that. He said, "No, we'll be back." He apparently went up over the side of the ditch. When I finished on the radio, we started crawling down this ditch. Stewart behind me came up behind another soldier. Didn't realize it until we got to the end of this ditch. It was the major who was leading the attack, and he had been wounded in the left wrist and was trying to keep this out of the water, so moved rather slowly. We got to the end of the ditch, and about that time, a buck sergeant from the infantry, and I never heard his name, but he appeared, and he had lost his rifle. Stewart had lost his carbine. I still had my carbine, and the major had his .45. I peeked up over the edge of the ditch and saw the German infantry coming in skirmish line formation. I reported to the major. He didn't say a word, and I waited 3 or 4 seconds, looked again. They were getting closer. I made the decision to surrender. This happens in seconds, and the kind of thing you're not prepared. I had my carbine. I might have wounded 1 or 2 of them with .45. It would have been suicide, I guess. But I've lived with that for 61 years. But I took my helmet off, and we wore the little knit caps. So I put that on the end of my carbine, held it up. Soldiers ran over, took the carbine, the .45, And then one of the men led us back to their command post within 50 or 75 yards. We're interrogated by, and I don't know whether he was an officer or a non-com, but he spoke very good English with a Brooklyn accent. Turned out he'd grown up in Brooklyn. His main interest was in cigarettes, and I said, I don't smoke, but he patted me down, and that morning I put a little 4-pack of cigarettes of a C ration in my coat pocket. He kind of smiled and said, I thought you didn't smoke. So they sent us on into the rear, and I was in the lead, the other 3 plus the German guard on a trail. Probably hadn't gone more than 200 yards from the command post when some of the artillery, I'm sure from my own outfit, started coming in. I heard the shell coming in. I dived into a shallow depression on the right side of the trail, looked around, saw the other 3 plus the German going down a steep bank on the left. My first thought, maybe I've got a chance to get out of this yet. Started to get up and discovered blood was filling my left pant leg. Felt around, obviously a piece of shrapnel had severed the artery behind my left knee. My first thought was to stop the bleeding. Took my belt off, put it around my thigh. About that time, 2 German soldiers came down the trail. One stopped, tried to help with the belt, but the buckle broke, so he went on. And I thought it was pretty smart. I could see a bunker maybe 75 yards across this clearing. I thought if I can get to that bunker, at least I won't get hit again. The last I remember, I crawled the last few yards, kind of pulling at the grass, got to the front of the bunker, rolled over my back, and 2 German soldiers came out, were looking down at me, and I lost consciousness. Several hours later, sometime through the night, I regained consciousness, and it turned out I was in a German field hospital in the city of Saarbrücken.
That's a lot to go through. You're in the captivities of the Germans, you're wounded, don't know about your leg, probably thinking what's going to happen. There's a lot of thoughts going through your mind at that time, laying in that cot. How was the treatment that you received from the Germans?
Well, as far as, when I woke up, I was in a room, I suspect had been a schoolhouse, or it was a big masonry building, but there were 7 or 8 cots or beds around the walls. The window was covered with a blanket. There was a small table with a little candle on it in the center of the room, and I could hear artillery, so I knew I was still in the general area. I thought they were all Germans in the bed beside me. Those first 3 days, I don't know how soon the gangrene set in, but 3 days later the German doctor said gangrene set in, we'll have to take the leg off. But my response was 1 leg or 2. And trying to crawl down that ditch, I'd scraped up both knees, and he smiled and he spoke very good. And he said, no, just 1. I vaguely recall complaining about the bandage around my leg. It was too tight. And apparently the pain from gangrene is pretty intense. Just a few years ago, I got an email from a man, turned out he lived down near Sacramento. He had seen an email I had sent to Jim Hansen and signed by Dale. And this email read, Dale, in 1945, I was in a German hospital, and the man in the bed next to me was named Dale. He'd been an artillery Forward Reserve party, hit by his own artillery, lost a leg. Is there any chance you're that Dale? His name was Bayard Walker, and he had been in the bed beside me there in that German field hospital. And he says, when they brought you in, or I guess he came in later, a day later after me, but he said, you were making so much noise, I thought they might shoot all of us Americans just to get rid of you. That 3rd day I woke up, saw your bed was empty, I thought, well, maybe we'll survive this yet. He said 2 hours later they rolled you back in, minus your leg, and you were the nicest guy after that. So he's told me more about what happened those 3 days. But on the 3rd day, the doctor amputated my leg. That night they decided to evacuate the hospital. I'm sure they thought the 70th was going to move into Saarbrücken any time. It was actually a month later before they did. But they put us on stretchers, carried us down to the train station, loaded us on boxcars that had straw on the bottom and a potbelly stove. We moved most of the night, but it was in kind of fits and jerks. The Allies would bomb the tracks during the daytime. The Germans would get out and repair it at night. And we actually moved only about 20 miles to the town of St. Wendel. and put into a kind of a collection or staging area there. And again, in a building, possibly a school building, but no beds. I actually had mattresses on the floor, and Bayard was on the mattress next to me. We were there probably 5 or 6 days before then I was put on a train. I don't think there was any other American in that part of the train, but for the next several days, 6 or 8 days, we moved mostly by train, sometime by ambulance, from that near Saarbrücken in western Germany, down to a town called Donau-Eschingen. D-O-N-A-U is Donau, the German word for Danube. And Donau-Eschingen is a town of 15,000 people at the south edge of the Black Forest, and that's where the Danube River originates. So I and 2 other Americans wound up in a hospital there that had probably 1,200 German wounded. And we were within 6 or 8 miles of the Swiss border. And, was there then for, well, when we arrived, the nurse in charge of that wing of the hospital was a tall, stern German woman, probably in her 40s. Heard later that her father was a general in the German army. She was a Catholic nun, and it was obvious caring for the enemy wasn't going to be all that a delightful experience for her. But within 3 or 4 days, her name was Sister Maria, she came to our room and asked if we would help her learn English. Rosemary, the young girl in her early 20s, that part of the hospital that spoke some English, told us that Sister Maria had believed all of the propaganda the Nazis had put out over the year, that American soldiers were brutal, would beat children with the butts of the rifle, that kind of thing. But it was obvious all 3 of us were young and not the type that would do that sort of thing. So we've said that within a few days we undid all of that Nazi propaganda over the years.
So something good came out of it after all, a little bit.
Good, yeah.
Was your treatment adequate from the Germans?
The Germans were very short of food and medical supplies, but certainly adequate. And trying to think of differences between how I was treated as a prisoner and the German wounded. And I never got to a German or to a prison hospital even. It was always a German hospital, German wounded, and a few.
So you were never associated with a POW camp?
No. In fact, I never got a POW number. Of course, this was February, and the war was
Winding down.
a pretty chaotic stage at that time, and so it wasn't the normal POW experience. But there were 2 occasions. One was, I think, early April, possibly March. Anyway, the custom was to give, it had to be March because we were still there at St. Wendel. There were about 8 of us Americans in the room at the time. And they brought the custom was to give a bottle of schnapps to every 2 German soldiers. And I don't know whether it was Hitler's birthday or what the occasion was, but they gave us 1 bottle of schnapps for all 8. I had my first sip of schnapps on that day. The other was when traveling by train. The trains only moved at night because the Allied controlled the air. But the trains would stop at these little villages in the early evening. Women would come aboard with baskets of cookies or fruit. They could tell by looking that I wasn't German, but they would ask Flieger, a flyer. They hated the pilots because of the bombing of the homes. And when you said 9, they'd give you the apple or the cookie.
And so did you stay in the hospitals up until the war ended, traveling from hospital to hospital, basically?
Well, basically, the German field hospital in Saarbrücken that first 3 days, a staging area then at St. Wendel for 6 or 7 days, then several days of traveling, then in the hospital in Donau-Eschingen. So I was only in the 2 hospitals during that 2 months as a prisoner.
When did you find out the war was over? What happened?
Well, excuse me. This Rosemary, the young girl that would come to our room, 2 or 3 times. She's actually a physical therapist, Rosemary Lang, L-A-N-G-E, long time. And she was very aware of what was happening, that they were losing the war. She also knew what had happened when Germany occupied France, what the civilians went through. So she was prepared for the worst when they lost, or when they surrendered. So when 2 or 3 days before the Allied army got to Donau-Eschingen, she brought two good-sized boxes to our room and asked if we would keep them until the town had been occupied. Sister Maria brought a very small box of her possessions. This is, several weeks after we got there, asking if we'd keep that, which we did. The Allied Army, there was very little resistance. In fact, the only damage, I think, was to the waterworks there in the town. But it turned out to be the French Free Army that was in the very southern part of Germany. And what they did, they took the town with very little resistance, left about 200 soldiers plus a few French officers, and most of the soldiers were Moroccan. Then the main army headed on down the highway. And I think it was the second day that a division of SS troops that had been bypassed in the forest near there attempted to retake the town. Not only did the French soldiers fight them off, but any of the German wounded that could still get out, and even the civilians, because they said, if those SS men take the town, we will all be massacred, because we did not defend our homeland with our life. So there was a real effort. Fortunately, the SS had very little ammunition and food, and I'm not sure what happened, but they did not take the town. The third day, then Rosemary came to our room and for her boxes, and Sister Maria. Rosemary opened one, took 2 wristwatches and a camera out. She gave the wristwatches to the other 2 and gave me the camera. And then it was another, well, I guess when the town was first occupied, we didn't know, we just knew they were the Allies. But I was the only one of the 3 that was up on crutches at that time, and the doctor sent a nurse up and asked me to come down to his office. Got down there, and these 2 soldiers in GI uniforms, I said, "Hi guys," and all. It turned out they were French, so they didn't speak English. But later the doctor gave me his little automatic that he carried in his pocket, and one of the nurses gave me a knife with a deer head handle. Those are my 2 souvenirs from World War II. But after the 3rd or 4th day, and we were supposedly liberated, but we were still under the care of the Germans, and but we're anxious to make contact. So since I was the only one mobile, I decided to go out. I had heard there was a larger hospital there in the town, and didn't know where it was. Got out on the street, and a man came along driving. It wasn't a horse, but some kind of animal pulling a cart that had a tank on it. He was going for water, and he offered me a ride. I think he had been a displaced Central European, slave labor kind of thing, and he was liberated. So somehow conveyed the idea I wanted to go to the other hospital. During that ride, he reached under the seat, pulled out what turned out to be a can of sardines. Hitler, the Nazis, had warehoused food in caves and all, and they liberated a cave full of sardines, apparently. He stuck that knife, he opened the can, stuck it into that sardine. That was the dirtiest looking knife I've ever seen. Sardines haven't tasted the same. I didn't eat the sardine, but they haven't tasted the same. But got up to the other hospital and found an officer up there who was out looking for strays. So he assured us he would arrange to get us out, and it was another day or 2. We were there a week after the town was liberated, so that was still, the war hadn't ended yet. This would have been about the 28th of April. So we were put on an ambulance that he had arranged for, the 3 of us, driven by a Moroccan. And it's typically about a 2-hour drive from Donaueschingen over to France to Strasbourg. And we took at least half a day, as I recall. As the Germans retreated, they felled the trees along the highway, and so it was kind of a zigzag course. But got to Strasbourg and was put in a French hospital. And I was there another 7 days before getting on a train to Mannheim. And so this is in the May now. So the war probably ended about the time we got to Mannheim, I would say. Was there another week, and it was there I was able to send a telegram to my parents. The Salvation Army said, I had no money, of course, and I tried to send a telegram, but the Salvation Army said, well, if you'll send it to your next of kin, you won't have to pay for it. So I was able to let my folks and my fiance know after 2 months that I was still alive.
And when did you hear back from your family that they had gotten the word?
Well, the few days then at Mannheim, well, incidentally, that's where I got my Purple Heart. I was in a ward with 20 people or so, and came back one day from somewhere, and the Purple Heart was laid on the bunk. But a few days there, and then put on a train to Paris, and that was where, at that time, they authorized flying back for amputees. So instead of riding a hospital ship or troop ship back, I got to fly back. Put on a converted B-17, flew to the Azores for refueling. Actually spent the night there because apparently the heater was not acting right, so did some repair work. From there, I think it was Iceland, and then Newfoundland, and then on. We were headed for New York City, got over Maine. The pilot came on board on the radio and said, we're having a little engine problem. We're going to have to land at Presque Isle, Maine. We found out later that his wife lived in Presque Isle, so we're never sure about how serious the engine. But anyway, they sent a C-47 up a couple days later and wound up in Texas, Temple, Texas, McCloskey General Hospital, an amputee center. And so that would have been in probably late May there. Got home on furlough, got back, and the doctor, the German doctor, had taken my knee off, taken my leg off just above the knee. And the doctor said, that stump is too long for a conventional artificial leg, so did a second operation in August, and so took off about halfway between the knee and the thigh. In September, late September, fitted with an artificial leg, a $800 carved out of wood leg with a metal hip joint and a white leather belt to hold it on. And by November 25th, I was sort of able to walk down the aisle, so Phyllis and I were married 1945, and discharged in January 8th of 46.